Meagan Morris is Professor of Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney in Australia, and she has been involved in martial arts studies as far as I've used it as a title for anything, kind of since day one. Good morning, good afternoon, Meagan. How are you doing?
Good afternoon and good morning, Paul. I'm doing well.
I'm up very early to talk to you today.
I'm impressed.
So you've since I've known you, you've always had such a kind of love for anything martial arts film, anything martial arts practice. I mean, the first time when you held the ACS Cultural Studies, Crossroads in Cultural Studies conference at Meagan University in Hong Kong, and I came, and you didn't really know me from Adam, but you'd never met me before, but I'd written a book about Bruce Lee, and you love Bruce Lee so much that you just took me under your wing, and you just kind of went, come on, I'll look after you, let's talk about Bruce Lee every waking moment and every gap in the conference. So, I mean, can you tell us something about that passion?
Well, it's interesting. It goes back a long way. Obviously, being a woman and of a certain age that came through feminism in the 70s, I'm often being invited into conversations about self-defense. But I got interested in martial arts to control my own violence, which is not, a topic. It's a topic I often try to talk about through films. But one of my earliest memories of school, I suppose I would have been about 7, and a boy was sitting behind me pulling my hair relentlessly, like this childish vignette. And when I look back, I realised I wheeled around with an absolutely perfect uppercut, instinctively, didn't know what it was. And I got into terrible trouble, because he cried. And that kind of came out of nowhere. And then, again, what is usually a boy's story, being bullied at school, like girls have unpopularity stories, whereas I was really quite severely bullied because I lived in a very remote bush town where my mother was a teacher and my father was the forester. So, that was like a really unpleasant situation, and I wore glasses. And one day somebody took my head and scraped it along a wall, scratching all of my glasses. And in those days, it took 17 hours by train to get from where I lived in the top of New South Wales to Sydney. And so my father took me into the bush and showed me how to make somebody fall over and then kick them in the head if they were pushing you. And then poor Dad, who was relatively recently returned from the war, kind of lost it, picked up a branch and showed me how to bayonet somebody. And this kind of exhilaration doesn't fit into a social path. But it was extremely powerful for me. So it was later, I suppose, in my, very early 20s, a boyfriend took me to a theatre to see Fist of Fury. And I didn't actually even understand it very well. You have to learn how to read those images. If you've only ever, well, I had seen very few films, and then the next one I saw was King Hu, which is a different sort of thing altogether, and I couldn't understand that at all. And of course, I loved that feeling as well. So from those bases, I was on my way anyway towards becoming a film critic for newspapers. I wanted to be a freelance writer. I didn't want to be an academic. And that was a good way to make money. So I began to see a lot of Chinese films. And at the same time, to bring it back, to your basic question, to be interested in physical disciplines that could make me feel happy. And there it is.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah, I didn't know that. I didn't know that, and I'm sorry, and I want to go and obviously, get the bullies. Yeah, I wonder how. It'd be really interesting to find out how widespread that, like, a complex relationship to violence and fear and maybe bullying. And
that's right. I mean, I'm not saying that I am not interested or needful realistically of self-defense and that type of discourse for women, but actually what happens to me is I'm a danger to myself and others, because if I lose my temper, I think I'm 7 feet tall and I will just fly at somebody's throat. And I needed to be in a long-term relationship for the man involved to point out that he was the one that would get hit in a social situation. So having an interest in philosophically and aesthetically rich, complex ways of reshaping one's own impulses is very important to me, and very, very interesting. But I think it's a very gendered discourse, the way we describe it.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I guess that's the assumption, but when these narratives come out, then I guess
women do self-defense. Men worry about the difference between violence and martial arts. I mean, I know that is not actually the case in terms of the distribution. I'm just reading this wonderful book which I found out about from your podcast.
Janet O'Shea.
By Janet O'Shea, and she talks about issues that are not commonly raised in.
Yeah, have you read Martha McCoy's book about she did 2 books. One's called Real Knockouts, as in the word real, actual existing knockout. Another one is Real Knockouts, which is like cinema real. I haven't read the film book, but I've read the self-defense book. That's a really good starting point for people thinking about gender and the gendered propensities of bodies. And but anyway, that's a different thing. So in your career, you started out as a journalist, as a film critic, and you gradually became involved. I mean, there's a lot of stuff written that credits you with a really formative role in the birth of the institutionalization of cultural studies in Australia. And from there, you took a job in Hong Kong, which I guess was a bit like paradise for someone who is interested in all things Chinese martial artsy.
Absolutely.
So because when you went to, looking at your publications list, and by the time you get to Hong Kong, you're really writing about transnational sort of action film and well, transnational kind of popular culture, aren't you?
Yeah. I mean, but that was that interest came out of being an Australian film critic in the 70s and 80s and 90s, where the industrial difficulty of continuing to produce films as an English-speaking and not particularly sort of significant country produced lots of formally fascinating problems. So in order to survive, the Australian film industry had to learn very early on how to globalize in that way that also speaks directly to local publics. Because if you don't do that, then they get really cross and don't come, and the market's very small here. So the first person to do that really successfully was Dr. George Miller with Mad Max, and then the 2 subsequent Mad Max films, Road Warrior and Beyond Thunderdome, have really dense Australian historical subtexts if you know how to read them, but you don't have to read them in order to get pleasure out of those films if it's the type of genre that you enjoy. So I quickly discovered that Hong Kong cinema differently situated, but similar issues would be raised in terms of aesthetic practice. And I always like looking at practice, whether it's martial arts or filmmaking. And so, you know, I started out writing a book about action cinema, which I've always loved. Always. I mean, I hate horror films. I don't like the inside of the body coming out. I like explosions and blowing shit up, you know. And I was looking at that as a key transnational discourse in the 80s, you know, with the Die Hard films. Hollywood films began to talk about cultural globalization quite explicitly in that period. And I just realized I really didn't know anything about Hong Kong cinema. So many, many years later, I was already in my late 40s when the opportunity to go to Hong Kong to work came up. And I jumped at it, but that was actually my first full-time academic job ever. My first 50 years, I survived as a freelance writer in ways that's difficult now, of course. Yeah.
So you're, there's a couple of questions on the back of that, but I guess you always, when you read Meagan Morris's work, it's always seems quite dense, and that denseness seems to be organized by the fact that you pay lots of attention to the production and the issues of production and the cultural context and the history of when something was made, and you also pay attention to, like, well, who's going to receive this, not in a simple, like, formal sender receiver type thing, but like, this is a complex cultural context with its own history that we should need to be attentive to if we're to get this properly. And why is this context interesting? What does this context make of it? And I guess that care makes your reading sometimes quite challenging for people who don't know what to expect, do you think? Would that be fair to say?
Oh, that's quite true. I mean, it sometimes makes it intolerable for people, and especially now where it's nobody's fault, but most academics have to be extremely instrumental, particularly if they're using the Harvard referencing system, you know, where you can cheat. You can have a vague idea of what some article's about, and you just want to put a few proper names in the brackets, so that the referee will say, yes, this person is across the literature. So that type of flip, what can I quote out of this in order to get through refereeing? I mean, that is extremely hostile to the sort of work that I do. And, you know, I don't care. Like, I have actually made my living over a 15 period writing the equivalent of shock horror cat caught up tree. You know, I can write very simple journalism. But when I work for myself intellectually, I don't want to do that. I want to really understand how I see films as events, not as texts. And I want to know how this event occurs in particular time and place, but then all of the relays that occur when other people take it up.
You also like to talk about issues that you've been really mulling over, like really reflecting on it, the kind of thing that can keep you awake at night. So you write about, there'll be several issues. It's not like in this article, I'm going to find out whether contemporary Hollywood action cinema steals some of its ideas from Hong Kong or something like that. It's never, ever going to be that simple. It's always about, like, questions of what violence is, questions of cultural difference, and questions of tradition, and just so many things distilled into it that it obliges a kind of really slow and attentive reading to appreciate the richness rather than density. It's like so I find that with some of your essays, you go back to it for many different reasons. It becomes a resource Like one essay will become a resource for rumination or for my own thinking about my own angle through certain thematic questions about culture or violence or identity, or film, I suppose, as well.
Well, that's nice to hear. I mean, it makes me very, very slow, but it's like, yeah, I can't help it. It's just how it is.
Yeah. And when you came to the first martial arts, so I decided to try and have a conference, and we had a conference in 2015, and you came and you talked a lot then about like kind of Hong Kong activism and like cultural activism, and this was before like the Bruce Lee be water stuff was becoming a slogan for protesters. It was you were talking about that impulse. So it's not about the status of Bruce Lee in Hong Kong politics, but the use of certain kinds of complex sets of imagery to articulate the protest. You were
That's
there
right. Yes,
quite early on in the game, weren't you?
Yeah, it was a period. I think in 2014, maybe a group called Mockingjay had a very straight rip-off of Tarantino's methodology of stitching things together, and they stitched together as the basic narrative of the most popular commercial Hong Kong film of that year, which is a wonderful film called Unbeatable in English. But they made it about the demonstrations which were beginning, to take shape, and a wonderful moment where a group in real life, a group of climbers climbed the face of the Lion Rock, which is an extraordinary symbol for Hong Kong people, and hung a huge yellow, banner across it. Can't have been 2014. Anyway, it was in the umbrella movement moment. And what was extraordinary, because Unbeatable is so classical in its training sequences, like quite a few Hong Kong films, it mixes explicit recalls of Rocky with classical kung fu scenes, and this little protest online film, which is vaporized now, did that in a wonderful way. So I talked about what a very classical story it was, and why this type of martial arts pedagogy narrative is repeated over the decades with wildly different political contents. But the durability of those stories is something I think a lot of Western fans even fail to really get to grips with. There's a deep, deep memory in Chinese popular culture generally. I mean, a more restricted range of core stories, but a very long sort of heritage of transformation.
So you mentioned pedagogy. You seem to be consistently interested in pedagogy in different ways. I mean, I'm thinking about the essay Learning from Bruce Lee, which is one of my all-time favorites. And it's about, like, if I ask you rather than me trying to summarize it, what would you say is the status of pedagogy and martial arts pedagogy, or learning about pedagogy from martial arts, or like what's the status of pedagogy within that, or your work generally? What's the interest?
That's a really hard question. I don't know. It's I don't remember that essay very well.
Okay.
But it's quite interesting. As we speak, I'm writing about it in the Hollywood working girl films of the 1980s.
Okay.
And it is something to do with how different versions of pedagogy can give you new paths to freedom. I think it's in a way that simple. And I love those stories because I'm always looking for such paths myself. And it's really not all that complicated. And then particular instances become complicated, you know, in terms of how much other stuff they put into this basic mix. But one of the reasons why I love Hong Kong pedagogy films is that there's potentially so very formalistic. You know, you are rarely surprised at the level of the overall story. I mean, it does happen, but not all that often. And so everything wonderful is in the variation. You know, I'm a sort of affectively, I'm deeply a Deleuzian, and I love continuous variation. And that is what is in the core of that aesthetic for me. But it also occurs in Hollywood. I'm trying to explain why I think, you know, the much maligned film Showgirls is a much better pedagogic film than Pretty Woman, but this is not your problem, Paul.
Okay, thank you. I'm glad. Interestingly, it's funny the way that, but it might become so, and it probably unexpectedly will. There'll be some point in a few years I'll be like really worrying about this question and trying to work it out. I was talking to Peter Lorge, the historian, and he, and it was after we'd done the podcast recording thing, and he said that he said something at the conference. He said, "Oh, like films because they're not real." And you, after his talk, you put your hand up and you were like, "I just want to take issue with that. Films really are real," and I think he's been sort of beating himself up for using that expression in the first place, but also thinking about the status of film in relation to history and reality and culture and everything. It's like it hasn't gone away since then. So just to add a little bit something to this debate, what if you say films are real? I mean, what does that mean to someone who's like maybe really straightforward? Film is fiction, Bruce Lee is fantasy, kung fu films are fantasy. How is a film real for you?
Well, all the things you mentioned earlier. I mean, I think historians get into terrible strife because the first word they think of is fiction. You know, I mean, a film is not just fiction. It's a creation, but so are lots of real things, including the technology we're using now. So film is real because it's produced by a vast industry which employs squillions of people. It's distributed into social situations which are completely real. And it's real because it gets into your head. It gets into your dreams. I'm old enough to swear that people kiss differently now because of movies than they did 60 years ago or 50 years ago.
Okay.
You know, you see images of things and you cannot not be changed by that, which is, to come back to martial arts pedagogy, what emulation is about.
Yeah.
It's like you make a video for me, and because I'm a bit crippled at the moment, I'm imitating your gestures. This is real. What's not to be real about that? But the old school sort of version of film and the imagination as fictitious and therefore somehow factitiously invented, really just misses all that, just discards it. And they end up saying really silly things.
Would be interesting to have a look at the history of movie kisses, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And the changing genre of kisses, because you know when it comes to everything really, the genre, the style within films changes, styles of fighting changes, even within traditional or authentic, even within nostalgic types of films, the fighting, the choreography and the editing is all different. And you know, yeah, I agree. I mean, that's a very kind of like Marcel Maussian kind of a thing, isn't it? Like people see it on the screen and then they go and do. So fighting has changed. I remember maybe 10 years ago, maybe more, someone pointing out, this is just one of those factoids that may or may not be true. Like in a fight now, because of the UFC, someone is equally as likely to throw a kind of swinging, arching right haymaker as their first technique as they are to charge in for a double leg takedown, because they've watched it so many times.
I mean, this is a point that you've made yourself very well, you know, in your writing, that very few people now are not in some way shaped in their perception of martial arts by some kind of cinema or other audiovisual imagery. And it comes down to the most fine-grained types of reality. Like when I lived in Hong Kong, I could afford and had the time to do one-on-one boxing training with one person 5 times a week.
Mm.
Can't do that in Sydney. I couldn't possibly. So I swallowed my pride and started joining boxercise classes. And while I was in Hong Kong, I had kind of missed a lot of the shift to MMA styles. I did go to see one match, and it was really creepy because there were these white corporate women smashing each other with the Chinese trainers cacking themselves all around the ring, really enjoying it. I go to boxercise, and they hand out pads to you and put it on the ground and get you to go like this. You know, now it could have been Wing Chun, but of course it wasn't. It was straight off MMA imagery, and really, I thought it was really stupid. And I said, "Excuse me, can I just kick the bag? You know, I'm nearly 60. I do not want to get on the floor and do this.
I don't want to do ground and pound,
No, but that, you know, this sort of 10th rate gym imperative that this is what you should be doing. Straight out of media. It's straight out of media. And it's real. It's I can, you know, take you around the corner to this gym. It's a real place and people are doing this. Why? It's
Interesting. Okay, so in terms of your current work, I get, like, what are you working on? What's in process? What's your current interests in this? Not in terms of working girl, but in terms of maybe in terms of things slightly closer to martial arts.
Yes, no. Well, as you know, I've been working for many years with my colleague, Sifu Stephen Chan, not Sensei Stephen Chan, from Meagan, on a book about how martial arts films made in Hong Kong since 1997 have, in the ways in which they rework classic stories, responded to the spiral of changing situations and public feeling in that place. I don't want to say too much about it because I feel I jinx myself, but with typical slowness, you know, I think I've been writing the outline back and forth with Stephen for maybe 18 months. And once I can finish these essays that, you know, about other things, I want to complete that, and then we will just write the book.
Yeah. And will the writing be easier once you've agonized out the you know, the structure of it, or
yes,
it will just because you're working out the actual details? But what about this? But what about that? You're really,
that's right.
So you're not just doing a basic sketch like this. Chapter 1 we'll talk about this era. Chapter 2 we'll talk about this. It's like you working out exactly what. Okay.
You might hate to hear this, Paul, but the unfinished outline is already 70 pages long.
Okay. Which
So I will, when
then,
it's finished, I will have to sit down and turn it into something different. But we have a very, not a problem, but a condition to confront,
Mhm.
which I think is structurally significant, like real, in that I'm a native speaker of English.
Mhm.
Who loves martial arts cinema, have a little bit of Cantonese, but that's mostly swearing and food.
Mhm.
And Stephen is fluent in Mandarin and Cantonese and spoken English, but he writes completely,
Mhm.
differently in English.
Mhm.
So how do you write? And he's interested in Hong Kong much more broadly.
Mhm.
And he also knows all of the mainland Chinese scholarship on martial arts mythologies. So how do you actually really write a book together?
Yeah.
And something we originally had a third collaborator, Lei Xulong, to whom we're very indebted who spoke at your conference, for
Mhm.
many ideas. But I could always see something coming where at the end they would just write their thing with their interests and their background, and I would have an impossible task to produce a uniform English text
Mhm.
which a publisher would look at.
Yeah.
So what we decided to do was agree step by step on the shape of the argument. So I would draft the outline of each chapter sometimes 3 times
Mhm.
till we secure that. Inevitably, at the end, there will be stylistic issues, but there won't be fundamental nightmare intellectual gaps.
Okay.
But if you don't do that sort of work,
Mm.
and this is why, I guess I'm some kind of fundamentalist, really, but if you don't do that sort of work, you are not doing transnational collaboration. You're doing globalized,
Mm.
Anglo, processed work.
Because you probably still are a bit involved, but you were very involved in the Inter-Asia Cultural Studies Association. Is it Association or Society? Um,
Society.
Society. And that was very kind of organized by problematics taken from post-colonial studies and the idea of collaboration and in a kind of in a non-Western or non-US kind of, so the idea was everything doesn't need to go through the structures and logics and values and everything of a dominant Anglo-centric Western, I'll use the word hegemony for the sake of it.
I would say production process.
Okay.
Because, one of the things that is important in Inter-Asia is Quan Xing Chen, who was the original animator of it,
Mm-hmm.
was very determined from the beginning to not only excavate intellectual histories from the Philippines to Thailand and South Asia, as well as the Japanese and Chinese areas that are better known in the West,
Mm-hmm.
but also to distribute them, to get other people to read them. And the older generations were extraordinarily learned in Western thought. Key Japanese philosophers of the mid-20th century studied with Heidegger. They were all influenced by Marx. So it's never a sort of let's dump the West thing, although it can be a let's parochialize it in Deepesh Chakravarty's term.
Yeah.
But it's much more about how you go about working together, how you produce collaborative work and learn about each other to produce something which would not have been written without that collaboration.
Okay. And what do you, just as a, I guess, because we're both cultural studies type people, in our, at least in our titles, in our job titles.
Mm.
What do you think about the status of the study of martial arts within that kind of disciplinary field? I mean, have you seen it change over the years? And I guess when we say, I'm going to say martial arts in a very broad sense, you can interpret that anyway. Like, have things changed, and which direction have things gone with the cultural studies or media studies, media culture, gender studies approach to martial arts, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, you would know much better than me, but I have sometimes felt that there was too much dismissal of film and cultural issues that were not about narrow understandings of the culture of a particular martial art. But I think as I look at the publications, many of which I found out about from you or Ben Judkin's Kung Fu Tea, which I read religiously, there is a much wider and richer conversation beginning to emerge. The other stuff is still there, you know, but I think that's not to do with martial arts so much as kind of really limited forms of sociology and very kind of thin understandings of the potential of history, which I would not attribute to Peter Lodge, by the way. I mean, I have to say his book on Chinese martial arts is the only dynasty-based history of China I have ever read all the way through. I mean, it's a wonderful book. But there are, you know, there are some pretty kind of skimpy things there. But I really feel that is shifting. And there's just, I can't understand why people don't rush into the field. It's the richest intersection of topics and problems that you could ever want.
Yeah, I mean, I still, because, you know, we only have a certain number of hours in the day and a certain number of days in the week and a certain amount of energy, but everything that I take into a much broader realm of teaching and reviewing and assessing, it's all really come to me through studying martial arts. If I'm interdisciplinary at all, it's because I've been trying to work out how to approach things in martial arts. I mean, it's the attempt to study martial arts that has broadened my intellectual horizons more than bringing broad horizons to a specific thing. And I think I can credit. I mean, I can acknowledge your role in that. The influence of your work on emphasizing not being complicated, the way that a theorist, like your caricature of a post-structuralist, is to be complicated. Like Ray Chow once wrote that the key strategy of deconstruction, post-structuralism, is to show that so things are more complicated, to make complicated. And that is largely a complicatedness of thought. But I think that your approach has been to go, but there's this issue and there's this issue and all of these things. Like it's not just complication as a principle, but as something that you discover by unwrapping and by going, how do I take this seriously? Like, where do I put it and where do I find it and where does it move and what is the significance of this as an event? So I don't know.
Why do I care about it? Huh?
Sorry? I said, is there
and for me, the question is always, why do I care about it?
Yeah.
Which is why I'm not a particularly disciplined person. You know, the cliche answer that historians used to give is, why did you study this person's life? Because it was there in the archive. You know, I never have an answer like that.
Yeah.
And I've never particularly liked excessively narcissistic writing. So the answer, well, because I love it, is not enough for me. So finding out why you care about this problem and not that problem is that's the way through to make something up.
There's a wonderful video online of you at a conference, like maybe a decade ago, maybe more, and it's a post-grad conference somewhere. and you're just going, you're sitting at the panel at the front and you're offering advice to grad, and you're like, for a presentation, don't tell us your methodology, don't tell us about that, tell us what you thought and what you found out. Like, tell us what your question was and then what you found out. Like, we don't care about interview samples and databases, just tell us what you have learned. Oh, that was brilliant. I always show it to PhD students, like, just tell us. Like, we don't care how you did it. Like, we can ask about that afterwards, but like,
That's right.
don't get
It's naughty advice for a social science thesis, but it's good advice for a presentation.
Yeah, definitely. Meagan, I just want to say thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day to talk to me. It's been an absolute pleasure. And hopefully, I know that we're hoping that we were meant to be together at a conference in France right now, in Lille. And then we were hoping to meet in Marseille in July, but that's all been COVIDed out of existence. But hopefully next year, eh?
I hope so. I mean, Australia there's no planes. They probably won't let us out of the continent till next year.
Yeah.
So, and then people say, why? And I say, well, it's 102 deaths. What do you want? You know?
Yeah. Okay.
But still, I hope I see you. And thank you for asking me.
Oh, thank you so much, Meagan. I'll see you later. Thank you.